They still tell a story in the Ash March about the woman who walked 300 miles with a newborn to hand a king his own son. They tell it as a warning, or as a joke, or as a love story, depending on the teller and how much the teller has had to drink. But if one wished to be fair about it, and almost nobody ever does, none of it would have happened if Sorrel Danvin had been the sort of woman who could be talked out of things. She could not. It was, her mother had once said, her single most expensive quality, and in fairness, if the king had simply told her his name that winter, she would never have needed to come looking for it. So really, when you followed the thread all the way back, the whole catastrophe was his. The doors of the Moon Court were made of white ash, and stood twice the height of a tall man, and they had not been opened for a woman like Sorrel in living memory. She stood in front of them with the road still on her boots, and her son asleep against her chest, and she was aware, distantly, the way one is aware of weather, that she smelled of horse and river and 12 days of hard traveling. The doorward looked at her, the way a man looks at a stain. State your business. Mine is with the king. Everyone has business with the king. Not like this. She shifted the sling and let him see. A small red fist, a tuft of dark hair. A face still crumpled from being new. The doorward's mouth opened, and nothing useful came out of it, and Sorrel walked past him. They could turn away a beggar, the great and the guarded, or a petitioner or a widow with a grudge. Not one of them knew how to turn away a baby inside. The Moon Court was one long white room with a floor of pale stone, polished by 300 years of important men standing on it, and Sorrel had never felt so filthy or so certain. Lords in grey, ladies in silver. The wolfkin of the high houses with their scent kept close and clean and cold, so that the whole hall smelled of nothing at all, which was its own kind of arrogance. She got 20 paces before somebody noticed her, and 30 before the hall went quiet. By 40, the silence had a shape to it, and she stopped in the middle of that pale floor with her son breathing against her collarbone, and every eye in Valemore upon her. A voice from the dais, dry as chalk, "You are lost." She knew the man on the steps. Everyone in Valemore knew him. Osric Thrale, warden of the naming rolls, keeper of the bloodlines, the man who decided which pups in this realm were somebody, and which were nothing. He had grey in his beard now, and the same still, patient, listening face he had worn 20 years ago, when he rode into the Ash March and found a half-feral girl in a ditch. Her heart did something complicated and unwelcome. "I am not lost, my lord." "Then, you are mad." Osric came down a step, looking at the bundle. "Whose is that child?" And Sorrel Danvin, who had never once in her life been able to lie and had built an entire livelihood out of that failure, said it plainly to a room of 300 people. "The king's." The hall did not gasp. It was far too well-bred for that. It made a low sound altogether, like a held breath let out through the teeth, and then it leaned in. "Explain yourself," said Osric, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before. A thin wire pulled tight under the calm. "Last winter, in the long frost, a man came through the Ash March alone and half dead. I took him into my croft because I would have done the same for a dog. He stayed 11 weeks. He told me his name was M." Her voice was flat and clear, and it carried. "He did not tell me the rest, and I did not ask. When the thaw came he went, and I did not think of him again until the sickness came on me in the spring, and I understood exactly what he had left behind. And you claim the king." "I claim nothing." Her chin came up. "I came to give him his son. What he does about it is his own affair, and I will not stand here and beg for it." Somebody at the back of the hall laughed. It was not a kind laugh, and it snapped off almost at once, because at the far end of the Moon Court the private door behind the dais had opened. Sorrel had spent 11 weeks in a snowbound croft with a man who could not chop wood and would not stop trying. She knew the sound of him. She knew it before she turned. The King of Valemore came through the door, and the room changed the way a room changes when weather comes into it, and every wolf in that hall felt their own back straighten without being asked. He was taller than she remembered, and cleaner than she remembered, and he wore the pale gray of the moon court, like a man who had been born inside it, and he was beautiful, and she hated that she had noticed. Emmerich Voss. His face had been in her pocket the whole way here, stamped on a worn silver piece. She had spent half of at a ferry. It was a poor likeness. They always are. Which was the only mercy in it, because if the coin had been any good, she would have known him in the snow, and she would have put him straight back out into it. He was smiling as he came in. The easy public smile, the one she had never once seen in the croft, and he was smiling because he was speaking to the woman on his arm. The woman was tall and serene, and she wore the deep blue of a foreign house, and her hand rested in the crook of his elbow, with the settled, unhurried confidence of a woman placed exactly where she is meant to be, and she was, Sorrel noted, with a strange, scalding clarity, extremely lovely. Then the king looked up and saw her. Sorrel watched the smile die by degrees, the way frost goes off a window. She watched his eyes find her face and stop, and travel down, and find the sling, and find the small dark head against her collarbone. He knew, in one breath, 40 paces away, with a stranger on his arm, he knew. And Sorrel saw the whole of him open like a struck door. Sorrel, he said. Nobody in the moon court had ever heard the king say a name like that. He let go of the woman's arm. He came forward one step, and his mouth opened, and Sorrel Danvin, who had walked 300 miles for one sentence, leaned in to hear it. And the herald, who had received his instructions an hour before and had not been told to look at the woman standing in the middle of the floor, filled his lungs, struck the stone twice with his staff, and announced to the assembled moon court the betrothal of Emmerich Voss, Alpha King of Valemore, to the Lady Verity Crane. There is a moment, when a body is badly hurt, before the pain arrives. A man puts his hand down on a blade and looks at the blood with mild interest, as though it belongs to somebody standing nearby. She stood in the White Hall and looked at the blood with mild interest. Around her, the moon court erupted into the most refined uproar in the history of the realm, 300 people saying nothing at all in extremely loud voices. She could see Emmerich's mouth moving. She could see him turn on the herald, with a violence that made 2 men step back. She could see the tall woman in blue, standing very still on the dais, with an expression that was not triumph and was not shame, and that Sorrel had no room in her head to hold. The baby woke and began with great commitment to scream. That was what got her out, not pride. Wick was hungry, and a long way from anything like a warm bed, and Sorrel's whole body turned toward him the way a needle turns north, and she was moving before she had decided to, out through the ash doors and into the first empty room she found. Wick, it was a hearth name, which in the Ash March means nothing at all. A hearth name is what a mother calls a pup at the fire. It has no weight. It cannot be written, and it will not stand up in any court in Vilemore. She had given it to him on the 4th night of his life, because he was small and warm and the only light in the house. He had no other name, and he could have no other name, because in this realm a child is named by the man who fathers it, spoken aloud before the court, and written into the rolls. And until that happens, the child is not a person. It can be given away, or sent away, or set outside in the cold, and no law in the land will say a word about it. She had known that when she started walking. She fed him in a cold antechamber, and her hands shook, and she made herself go through it again, because she was a tracker. And a tracker does not care what she wishes had happened. She cares what the ground says. The ground said this: 11 weeks, a croft under snow so deep that the door opened inward. A man with a fever, and a wound in his side that she had sewn shut with a horsehair thread. He had told her his name was M, and she had believed him, because he had been too ill to lie, and because she had wanted to. He had been useless. That was the thing she could not get past, sitting in that cold room with her son at her breast. Genuinely, magnificently useless. He could not lay a fire. He could not skin a hare. And he asked her questions for hours about tracking, about the marches, about what her people ate in a bad winter and how many died of it, and he listened to the answers with a hunger that had nothing in it of politeness. He had made her laugh 9 times. She had counted them, later, lying alone in the dark after he had gone, because counting was the only way she had found to make it hurt less. And on the last night, when the thaw came, and they both knew it, he had said a thing she had turned over every day since. "I am going to have to go back," he had said, "and be a man you will not like very much." She had thought it modesty. She was very tired of being wrong. When Wick was fed and sleeping, she went out into the corridor to find her way to the gate, because there was nothing left to do here, and she had a long road home. Osric Thrale was standing in the corridor. Sorrel stopped. He looked at her the way he had looked at her 20 years ago. Out of the saddle, down into a ditch, at a starved marcher girl who had bitten his groom. "You should have written to me," he said. And some hard thing she had been holding shut for a year cracked straight down the middle. "I did not think you would believe me, Sorrel." He said her name the way he had said it, when she was small and could not read. "I taught you to read a lie in a man's face at 30 paces. Do you imagine I would not know my own student's face when she is telling the truth?" Her eyes stung, and she was furious about it. "They are all laughing at me. They will laugh for a week. Then they will do the arithmetic, and they will stop, and that is when you are in danger." He came and stood beside her at the arrow slit, looking out at the grey courtyard. "A martyr woman with the king's firstborn in her arms is not a joke, child. She is a claim. There are 9 great houses in this realm who have spent a year assuming the throne would go to whoever the king married." Sorrel's arms tightened around her son. "Then help me," she said. "You are Warden of the Rolls. You are the only man in Valemore who can put a name in the book. Help me make him real." And Osric Thrale turned and looked at her, and for one strange half-breath she could not read his face at all, which had never once happened in 20 years. "I am sorry," he said. Then the bell above the moon court began to toll, and the doors at the end of the corridor opened, and the warden's men came through them carrying on a bier, a small shape wrapped in the grey of the moon court, with a sprig of white ash laid upon it. "You are too late as well," said Osric gently. "The king's son died in the spring. I saw him laid in the crypt. The whole court saw him laid in the crypt." And he put his hand on her shoulder, warm and steady and terrible, and said, "Whatever that thing is that you are carrying, girl, I would put it down." Afterwards, Sorrel could never remember what she had said. Only that 4 men had been required to keep her from going for the warden's throat, and that the whole time some cold, clear part of her had stood back with its arms folded and said, "That is not a dead child, that is a doll of wax and clay. They have packed it in ash and lavender, because a wolf can smell a lie, and they knew a wolf would come." They took her back to the moon court, and not gently. The hall was fuller than before. Word travels through a palace the way fire travels through thatch, and every soul in Hollowmere who could invent a reason to be in that room was in it. And Sorrel stood on the pale floor with her son in her arms, and a man on either elbow, and understood that she was going to lose him here, in front of all these people, and that there was not one thing in the world she could do about it. Osric spoke first, and he spoke beautifully, with the sorrow of a man who takes no pleasure in his duty. There had been a child, and it had been sickly, and it had died in the spring, and been laid in the crypt by the warden's own hand. And this woman had come to the moon court with some other woman's infant, and a story about a snowbound croft, and the kindest reading available was that grief had unseated her reason. "And the cruelest reading," said a lord at the back, "is that she was sent." The word went through the hall like a knife through cloth. Sorrel looked at the king. Emmerich Voss sat on the white chair at the head of the moon court, and had not spoken a word. His hands lay on the arms of the chair, perfectly still, and his face had gone somewhere she could not follow, and he was not looking at her. He was not looking at the child. That was the thing that finished her, not the beer, not Osric, not the woman in blue standing at the foot of the dais with her hands folded. It was that Emmerich Voss, who had knelt on the floor of her croft and asked her 10,000 questions and laughed with his whole chest and looked at her in that last week as though she were the only honest thing left in the world, would not turn his head 3 inches. "Your Majesty," said Osric, "the court awaits your word." The hall went so quiet that Sorrel could hear her own son breathing. "Speak the name," she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle, and she did not care. "You know it is yours. Speak his name into the rolls, and I will walk out of this hall and out of this city, and you will never see either of us again as long as you live. I do not want your court. I do not want your bed. I do not want one single thing in this house." She was shaking. "Give him a name, and I will go." Emmerich Voss looked at the far wall, and in a voice she had never heard from him. A smooth, cold, courteous voice. The voice of a man reading somebody else's letter aloud. The Alpha King of Valemore said, "I will not name that child." Something in Sorrel went out, like a candle in a draught. She did not scream. She had used all of that up in the corridor. She simply stood there with her son sleeping against her collarbone in the middle of 300 people and looked at the man she had carried through winter and felt the last warm thing in her chest quietly close its door. "Take her out," said Osric, with great compassion. "Somewhere warm. She has walked a long way." They put her in a tower room with a fire and a lock. A woman came to take the baby, and Sorrel explained, in the plainest language of the Ash March, precisely what would happen if she came a step closer. The woman went away, and Sorrel sat down against the door, with Wick in her arms, and did not sleep. Near the middle of the night, the lock turned. She was on her feet, with the fire iron in her fist, before the door had finished opening. The Lady Verity Crane stood in the doorway with a candle in one hand and a covered basket in the other, and she looked at the fire iron, and she did not seem in the least surprised by it. "You have not eaten," she said. "There is bread and cheese and a great deal of soup, and the soup is in the corridor, because I could not carry it and the candle together." Sorrel did not lower the iron. "You are marrying him?" "Yes," said Verity Crane. "Although I should like to say in my own defense that until this morning I was under the impression that I was doing him a kindness." She set the candle on the table and turned, and Sorrel saw that her eyes were red. "May I tell you 2 things, and then I shall go, and you may throw the iron at my head as I leave." Sorrel said nothing. "The first," said Verity Crane, "is that I was standing 10 paces from that bier this morning, and I have an ordinary nose and no talent whatsoever, and even I could smell the lavender from where I stood. They had packed that coffin like a winter apple." She paused. "You do not pack a thing that way to preserve it. You pack it that way when there is nothing inside it that smells of anything at all, and you are afraid that a wolf will notice." Sorrel's hand went numb around the iron. "And the second," the woman said, very quietly, "is that when Emmerich Voss said he would not name your son, he was lying. I have spent 4 months in that man's company learning to hear it. He was lying, and he was doing it in front of 300 people, and he was doing it on purpose." She picked up her candle. "I would ask myself, why? They did not come for the child at dawn, which surprised her, and they did not come at noon, which frightened her, because it meant somebody was thinking." Sorrel spent the day learning that tower room the way she would have learned a stretch of country. 1 oak door, hinged outward, 1 narrow window, with 60 feet of clean wall beneath it. Then she fed her son, and she waited. He came at dusk, alone, and he did not knock. Sorrel stood at the window with Wick against her shoulder, and did not turn round, and for a while the Alpha King of Valemore stood in the doorway of a locked room, and said nothing at all. "You have not eaten," he said at last. "The soup was excellent, your bride brought it." She heard him take a breath, and then decide against whatever had been on the end of it. "Sorrel, do not." She turned. "Do not say it like that. You do not get to say it like that anymore." And there he was. Away from that white hall, he was not a king at all. He was the man from the croft, standing in a doorway with his hands empty and his shoulders down, and the sight of him did something violent to her that she resented with her entire body. He looked as though he had not slept since spring. There was gray at his temple that had not been there in the snow. "I have come to make you an offer," he said, "and you are going to hate it. Then we are agreed on something. There is a post in this house that has stood empty for 2 years. Master of the Hounds is the polite name for it. What it means is that when a stag is lost, or a man is lost, or something is moving on the salt roads that ought not to be, the crown sends for somebody who can read ground." His voice was flat and careful, and his eyes were not. "I am giving it to you," Sorrel laughed, and it came out ugly. "This morning you stood in front of the realm and said my son does not exist. This evening you have climbed 60 steps to offer me a job. Because if you take it, you may keep him with you," he said. "A servant of the royal household eats at the crown's expense and sleeps behind the crown's doors and cannot be turned out into the road by a warden or a lord or anybody else in this kingdom without my word." He paused. "And because you cannot leave Hollowmere, if you walk out of that gate tomorrow with that boy in your arms, you will not reach the Ash March. I am not threatening you. I am telling you what the ground says." She stood very still. He had used her own words. He had listened, in a snow-bound croft, a year ago, and he had kept them, and he was handing them back to her, now like a coin she had lost. "And what will they call me?" she said. "When they see the martyr woman, with the mad story, living behind the king's doors." He did not look away. "They will say, 'I have kept you,'" said Emmerich Voss. "They will say the king has a marcher woman in a tower and a foreign bride in the chapel, and no shame in him at all. And they will say it for the rest of your life, and there is not one thing I can do about it. And you will let them." Something in her chest broke loose and came up her throat, and she could not stop it. "Then let me tell you what you have done." Her voice was shaking, and she let it shake. "Every soul who has ever kept me has kept me for what I could do. My father kept me because I could find the goats. The Marches kept me because I could find the bodies. Osric Thrale pulled me out of a ditch and put me in a schoolroom, and I have loved that man for 20 years, and I have never once been able to shake the knowledge that if I had been a stupid child, he would have ridden on by." She was crying, and she despised it. "And then a man came through the snow and asked me 10,000 questions. About the salt roads, about what my people eat in a bad winter, about how many die of it. And I answered every one, and I thought, this is what it feels like when somebody wants to know you." Her mouth twisted. "And it was an inventory. You were taking stock of your own kingdom, and I was the ledger, Sorrel. And now you have offered me a post, because I am useful." She lifted her chin. "And the very worst of it is that I am going to take it, because I have nowhere else in the world to put my son." The silence went on a long time. "You are right," he said. She stared at him. "About all of it. I did ask you those questions because I was a king, and I was frightened, and I had never once in my life spoken to somebody who would tell me the truth." He came one step into the room and stopped, and then it stopped being that. "And I did not tell you, and I went away without a word. And I have thought about the shape of your hands on that horsehair thread every day for a year. Both of those things are true. I know you will not believe. The second, I would not, in your place." "Then explain," she said. "Then stand there and explain to me why you would not look at him." And Emmerich Voss shut his mouth. He shut it the way a door shuts. "I cannot," he said. "Cannot or will not. Sorrel, I am asking you for something I have no right to ask for. You are asking for nothing. You have not asked me for one single thing since you walked through that door." She stepped toward him, furious, and Wick stirred against her shoulder, and she stepped again, and she was close enough now to smell him, and she stopped, because a tracker does not choose what she smells. She had grown up on scent the way other children grow up on words, and she stood there in the tower room and read the man in front of her the way she would have read a hillside. And what was written on him was this: grief. Old and thick and everywhere, so deep in the wool of him that it had had months to settle. Terror. Fresh, no more than a day old. And under both, faint, clinging to the cuff of his sleeve, where a man leans on a table, the dry sweet dust of ash and lavender, the beer. He had been at the beer, recently, alone. Long enough for it to get into his clothes. Sorrel's whole body went cold. "You have seen it," she whispered. "You have been down there and you have looked at it. You know it is not him." Emmerich Voss went the color of the wall. He turned round and walked out of the room, and he did not answer her. And the guard locked the door behind him, and Sorrel Danvin stood in the middle of the floor, with her son on her shoulder, and one thought in her head like a struck bell. He is not pretending our boy is dead. He is pretending our boy is dead. They came in the third hour after midnight. She had not slept. She never slept properly, with a fire in the room. An old marcher habit, because a fire ruins your night eyes and covers a footfall, and so she was lying on the floor by the cradle with her boots on, which is the only reason her son is alive today. She smelled him before she heard him: wet wool, cold iron. A man who had come up the outside of a tower in the rain. Sorrel did not open her eyes. She counted, and when the weight came down on the floorboard by the cradle, she moved. She took him low, and she took him hard, and they went into the table, and the basin burst, and he was strong and fast and very quiet, and she got a knee behind his, and an arm across his throat, and held on until he went slack under her, and then a while longer, because she was taking no chances with her son asleep 2 feet away. When she let go, he did not get up. She stood in the wreck of the room with her chest heaving, and her son screaming, and the guard hammering on the outside of a door he had locked himself, and she looked down. He had gone past the bed. He had walked within a pace of a sleeping woman, with a blade already drawn, and had not so much as turned his head, and he had crossed the whole width of that room in the dark, to reach the one thing in it that could not run and could not shout: the cradle. Sorrel Danvin stood there for a long moment with the whole world tilting slowly onto its side. They had not come for her. They had never once been coming for her. By morning the story had been decided, and it had been decided without her. A thief, said the warden's men. A chancer who had heard there was a woman in the tower and had gone up the wall for whatever a woman in a tower might have. Very sad, very shocking. The warden would look into the matter personally. Sorrel stood in the doorway of the ruined room, while they carried him out under a sheet, and she watched Osric Thrale stand over the mark in the floorboards where the knife had gone in, and she watched him not look at it, that was all. He simply did not look at it. His eyes went over the place where the knife had lain the way water goes over a stone. 20 years ago, a man had crouched in a wet lane in the Ash March and put his finger in a boot print, and said to a starving girl, "Everything a man does not want you to see, he will step around. Watch the feet. Watch the eyes." A liar walks the long way round the truth. She said nothing. She thanked him for his concern. She let him kiss her forehead, and she stood in the corridor afterwards, with her hands shaking so badly that she had to put them under her arms, because the one man in the world she would have taken this to was the man she was beginning, in some cold cellar of herself, to suspect. That afternoon she was moved, not down and not out, but across and along and up a private stair, into 2 warm rooms with a nursery attached, 7 paces from the king's own door. The whole of Hollowmere had the news before her boxes did. A lady of the Moon Court moved her skirts aside in a corridor the way you move them from a puddle. A boy in the kitchens called her something under his breath, and got the shock of his young life when she turned round. She was the king's marcher woman, and everybody knew it, and nobody said it, which was worse, because a thing that is never said cannot be answered. And Emmerich Voss did not come to her, and did not explain. He sent for her constantly. That was the game, and it took her a fortnight to see the shape of it. A horse gone lame on the North Road, and would she look at the shoe, salt, short, at the river gate, and would she tell him what the mud said? And every time she brought him an answer, He listened with that terrible attention of his and asked 4 more questions, and never once let the talk go near the tower or the beer or the boy. "You were at the crypt," she said to him once on the salt wharf, with the tide going out. "The gulls are worse this year," said the king, and smiled at her. And it was the public smile, and it went nowhere near his eyes. He was keeping her precisely where he could see her. She had no way on earth to know whether that was a cage or a shield. She watched him for danger. That was what she told herself she was doing, and it was even true, for about 9 days. She watched him carry the whole weight of a council session out of a room and set it down the instant the door shut, and she saw what it cost him in the half-second before he noticed her. She watched a man perform being a king from the moment he woke until the last door closed, and she began, against every instinct she owned, to want to make him stop. And then, in the middle of the 3rd week, she found him in the nursery. It was late. She had been out at the river gate until the small hours, and she came up the private stair with her boots in her hand, and the nursery doors stood open, and there was no candle. Emmerich Voss was standing over the cradle in the dark. He was not touching him. His hands were at his sides, closed into fists, and he stood a full arm's length back from the cradle, the way a man stands back from a fire he has been burned by, and he was looking down at his son with an expression that Sorrel would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said, very quietly to nobody, "I am so sorry." Then he turned and saw her in the doorway, and everything went out of his face at once, wiped clean, and he walked past her and out, and he did not say one word. She went out to the tower the next morning. Nobody had cleaned the room properly. Nobody ever does, in a house with 300 servants, because everybody assumes it is somebody else's work. She got down on the boards in her good gray coat and worked it the way Osric had taught her, on hands and knees, breathing shallow, following the wet wool and the cold iron out of the window and down the wall, losing it and finding it, and losing it again, going round the base of that tower 4 times before she picked the thread up by the kitchen midden. It took her all day. The trail ran along the inside of the curtain wall, where the guard does not walk, because the guard walks the top. It went behind the mews and through a gap, in a hedge that a big man would have had to turn sideways for, and she knelt in the wet grass, with 3 wool fibers off the thorns on her palm, and her heart going like a hammer. The trail crossed the yard and went up to a small plain door in the west face of the old keep, with a good lock and a new hinge. It opened onto the private stair of the warden of the naming rolls. She did not go to him that night. She sat on the nursery floor, with her back to the wall, until the sky went gray, and she took it apart and put it together 40 times, and every single time it came out the same way. And every single time she refused it. There was an innocent reading. There had to be. And that was the humiliating part, because she was a woman who had made her whole living out of being unable to lie, and here she sat doing it, fluently in her own head, to protect the man who had taught her the trade. She went to Emmerich at dawn. The guards on his door knew better than to stop the master of the hounds by that point, and she went through them like weather, and she shut the door behind her, and the King of Valemore looked up from a table of papers with 2 nights of no sleep under his eyes. "I am at the end of it," she said, Sorrel. "No, you will listen." Her voice was not steady, and she did not care. "I have watched you refuse my son in front of the realm, and then stand over his cradle in the dark and apologize to him. I have found a man on my floor with a knife who did not come for me, and every time I open my mouth, you hand me a horse to look at." She was crossing the room, without meaning to. "There are 2 men in my head and I cannot be rid of either of them. In the first, you used a woman in a croft for a winter, and went home and got on with your life. In the second," her breath went. "In the second, you are lying to the whole world on purpose, and I cannot see why. And I am so tired, Emmerich. I am so tired of not knowing which man I loved." The last word landed in the room and neither of them touched it. He stood up. "Ask me one question," he said. That I am allowed to answer. That is not an answer. That is a rule of the game. It is all I have. He came round the table. Sorrel, if I could take the top of my head off and show you what is inside it, I would do it standing here. I cannot. There are 140 people in this house who would be dead by the end of the week, and one of them would be very small. So ask me a question I can answer, and I swear to you on my mother's grave that I will not lie. She stood in front of him with her fists closed, and she did not ask about the beer, or the crypt, or the knife, or the warden. Do you want him? She said. Emmerich Voss made a sound like a man taking a blow. Every hour. I want him so badly. I have made myself sick with it. I go to that room every night after you are asleep, and I stand there and I do not touch him, because I do not trust myself to put him down again. His voice cracked open. I have known that boy existed for a month, and I have not held him once. Did you want me? In the croft, on the road, in that hall, with the whole realm watching, and every hour since. He was very close now. I went back to be a man you would not like very much, and I have been that man for a year, and I am so tired of it that I can barely stand up. Sorrel put her hands flat against his chest to push him away, and did not push him away. She could feel his heart going under her palms, like something trapped. I do not forgive you, she said. I know. I have not forgiven one thing. I know. Emmerich, she said, and her voice went to pieces, and he caught her face in both his hands and kissed her. It was not gentle, and it was not clever, and there was nothing of the court in it. It was a man who had been holding a door shut with his shoulder for a year, finally letting it go. Her hands went into his hair, and his arm came round her waist and lifted her clean off the floor, and the papers went off the table in a white cascade, and neither of them noticed. And underneath it, running through her like a current in cold water, was the wordless certainty of him, that he wanted her. Not her hands, not her nose, not her use. Her. Sorrel Danvin had been wanted for what she could do since the day she could walk. She had never once been wanted for nothing at all. Afterwards, in the grey light, with her cheek on his shoulder and his heart slowing under her ear, she said, "You will still not tell me." "No," he said, "not yet," and she should have got up. She knew it even then. The betrothal feast was 7 nights later, and Sorrel had to stand in it, because the master of the hounds attends the crown at a state occasion. So she stood at the edge of the moon court, in the grey and silver of the household, while the people who had watched her broken open in that same room ate roast swan, and did not look at her. Verity Crane sat at the king's right hand, serene and gracious and correct, and twice across that roaring hall she caught Sorrel's eye, and made a face of such pure and unladylike misery that Sorrel had to look at the ceiling. Emmerich found her by the pillars at the second hour. "You are not eating. I am working. You are hiding. I am doing both, your majesty. I am extremely capable." He laughed. A real one, surprised out of him, the way he had laughed in the croft, and heads turned all down the hall. And Sorrel watched him feel them turn, and watched the shudder come down over his face. "Come outside," she said. "You are about to fall over." He looked at her, and then, wonderfully, he came. The colonnade behind the moon court looked out over the black gardens, and there was nobody in it, and Emmerich Voss put both hands on the rail and let his head drop, and the king went out of him like water out of a jug. "I have been doing this since I was 19, he said to the dark, smiling, performing, being the thing they need, so that nobody looks too closely at what I am not. And what are you not? Enough." He said it lightly. "My father filled that hall. I have spent a decade learning to sound like a man who fills it." She reached up and turned his face toward her. "You are the only person in this house," she said, "who has ever asked me what I thought." And she kissed him, and the world came apart. It was not the heat. She knew the heat. This was under it, and behind it, and older. a warm, bright thread pulled taut from somewhere beneath her ribs to somewhere beneath his, and along it came everything he was, his exhaustion, his terror, his love, vast and unguarded, pouring into her like water through a broken wall, and shame, and grief, and the raw, howling, month-old desperation of a man who watches his own son every night and is not permitted to touch him. Sorrel tore herself back with a gasp. The tether, her grandmother's word for it. Emmerich was staring at her, white, his eyes blown wide. "You felt that," he breathed. "Sorrel. Sorrel that was." And Sorrel Danvin, who had been broken open in front of 300 people and had found a dead man on her floor, and had spent 1 month learning that she could not afford to be a fool twice, looked at the one true thing she had ever been given and said it was a kiss. Emmerich's face went still. "A kiss," he repeated. "That is all it was." Her voice was flat and cold, and it did not sound like her at all. "Do not build anything on it." Something closed behind his eyes. Not anger. Worse. A polite, courteous, careful shutting, and she watched a door she had only just found sealed up in front of her, and she wanted to claw it open with her hands. "Of course," he said, "forgive me." And then he bowed to her, in the dark, on the colonnade, like a stranger. She would have given 10 years of her life to take it back. She followed him in because she could not bear to stand out there alone, and that is the only reason she was in the doorway of the moon court when the nurse came through with her son. It was nothing. A nurse. Gray household wool, the boy over her shoulder moving toward the side passage, the way she did every night at that hour, and Sorrel very nearly let her pass, and then the air moved. Ash and lavender. Sorrel crossed that hall so fast that a duke went into a table. She had the woman by the arm and the child off her shoulder before the nurse had drawn breath to scream, and the music stopped in a long dying rag, and Sorrel Danvin stood in the middle of the moon court for the second time in her life, with her son in her arms and every face in Valemore staring at her. "Search her," she said, and her voice went up into the rafters like a bell. "Search her sleeves and her apron. She has been standing beside a bier in a crypt within the last 2 hours, and I should like this whole hall to hear her explain why." The nurse ran. She got 4 paces before Verity Crane, who was closest and who was wearing a very great deal of Aldwych silk, put out one long blue leg, and dropped her flat on the floor of the moon court like a sack of grain. The hall exploded. And in all that noise, with his son screaming in the arms of a martyr woman in front of the whole realm, the Alpha King of Valemore stood at the head of the room and looked at Sorrel, and did not move, and did not speak, and did not come. She stared at him. "Get up," she thought. "He is yours. Come and get him." Emmerich Voss turned his head away. She left before the guards had finished shouting. She carried Wick up the private stair with her chest full of broken glass, and she fed him, and she lay down in her clothes with him against her side, and near the middle of the night she got up to put him in the cradle. The cradle was empty. Sorrel came out of that room like something loosed off a chain. She went down the private stair barefoot, with her knife in her hand, casting for scent, and she caught it at the bottom and followed it along the black corridor, toward the east postern. And she came round the corner in the dark and stopped. There was a lantern set down on the flagstones, and there was Emmerich Voss, in a plain traveling cloak, with the postern key in one hand, and their son in his arms. Emmerich Voss did not run. That was the first thing, and afterwards, it was the only thing she could hold on to. He stood in that black corridor, with the postern key in one hand, and his son in the crook of the other arm, and when he saw her, he did not run, and he did not lie. He closed his eyes. "Put him down," said Sorrel. "Put my son down on the floor and step away from him, or I will open you from your hip to your collarbone, and I am asking you to believe that I can. I know that you can." He crouched slowly and laid the child on the folded cloak on the flagstones, as gently as a man setting down water, and he stepped back with his empty hands open. You are the only person in this house I have never once doubted. She got between them. She did not pick the boy up. She kept her eyes on the king. Say it, she said. There is a boat at the river stair, said Emmerich Voss. There is a woman in it who nursed me when I was 4 years old, and she has been waiting in the reeds since the second bell. She would have taken him to the Aldwych coast tonight, and he would have been raised by fisherfolk who cannot read, in a house with no name over the door, and he would have been alive. There was nothing behind his eyes at all. And you would have woken in the morning to an empty cradle and believed for the rest of your life that I had killed him. I had made my peace with that. It was the only plan I had that ended with him breathing. And Sorrel Danvin, standing in the dark with a knife in her hand, felt the whole architecture of the last month come apart and reassemble itself. The name, she said. He said nothing. That is the whole of it. Her voice was going strange and far away. A child with no name is nothing, and the moment you speak his name in that hall, he becomes the firstborn son of the Alpha King. Yes, said Emmerich, and they kill him that night. Before the ink is dry. The corridor was very cold. You stood in front of 300 people, she said, and you looked at the far wall, and you said you would not name my son, and I have hated you for a month. Yes. You are the only thing keeping him alive, Sorrel. He said, I would have let you hate me for 50 years. She turned away from him. She had to. She got 2 steps down the corridor and put her hand flat on a cold stone of the wall and stood there breathing like a woman who has been running. And then, because she was who she was, she kept going. You knew? She said to the wall. Before I walked into that hall. Silence behind her. There was a body on a bier 11 hours after I arrived. Nobody carves a child out of wax in 11 hours. That thing was made in the spring. She turned round. Which means somebody told you in the spring that you had a son, and somebody told you in the spring that he was dead. Osric came to me in the 4th week of the thaw, he said quietly. He said there had been a woman in the ash march. He said she had borne a child too early, and that it had not lived an hour. He said he had ridden out himself to see it done properly, and had laid it in the crypt with his own hands, and he brought me a lock of black hair in a paper. And you believed him. He is the warden of the rolls. His mouth twisted. He has been the warden since before I could walk. When my father died, there was one man in this house who did not want anything from me, and I have leaned on him for 11 years, like a stick. And you did not come. The words came out of her flat and hard, and they went into him like a nail. Sorrel, I want you to hear it, so I shall say it slowly. She walked back up the corridor toward him, and she was not shaking anymore. You were told that a woman in the marches had carried your child alone through a winter and borne it alone, and watched it die alone, and you did not send for me. You did not write. You did not put one man on one horse. You sat in this white palace and grieved beautifully and did nothing. I know. Why? Because I am a coward, said the Alpha King of Valemore, and because it was convenient. She stopped. In the same month, he said, Osric brought me the Aldwych match, a bride, an alliance, 3,000 spears on my northern border, and all I had to do was sign. And I was tired, and I had just been handed a very good reason never to go back to that croft and look you in the face, and I told myself it was for the realm, and I signed it. He looked at her steadily. He handed me my grief and my marriage in the same week, and I never once asked why they had arrived together. She could not breathe. He built it, she whispered. All of it, yes, and longer than you think. There are 9 great houses in Valemore, and the warden of the rolls has written every name in all of them for 30 years. He does not want the crown, Sorrel. He wants to go on choosing who wears it. A marcher boy, with no house, and no blood, and no book behind him, was never going to be permitted to exist. He paused. And neither, I think, was his mother. Sorrel put her back against the wall, and slid down it, and sat on the freezing flagstones beside her son. He pulled me out of a ditch, she said. He taught me everything I have. He taught me to read ground, and he taught me to hear a lie. Her face was wet, and she did not bother with it. And he taught me that a marcher woman is a useful thing, and never a wanted one, and that if I was very good and very quiet and very useful, they would let me stay. And she stopped. Because she could hear him, 20 years of him, in schoolrooms and stable yards and wet lanes, saying it with enormous kindness, "Do not reach above your line, girl, they will only take the hand off. The crown does not come for people like us. You are a tool, and a good one, and there is dignity in that." She had carried that voice in her own mouth for 20 years, and never once noticed that it was not hers. "He was not raising me," she said. "He was fitting me." Emmerich knelt down in front of her. "May I tell you," he said, "how I knew that you were not his?" She looked up. "Because you walked into the moon court with nothing at all, in front of the whole realm, and told the truth even though it destroyed you. A plotter lies. A plant lies. A woman sent to ruin a king has a story that cost her nothing." His voice was very low. "You stood on that floor and handed them a weapon to use against you for the rest of your life, because you have never in your life been able to do anything else. That is how I knew, in the first 10 seconds. And Sorrel Danvin understood that she was being told she was loved by a man she could no longer afford to believe. She got up. She picked up her child. "I am glad you did not put him in a boat," she said. "Sorrel, you thought our son was dead, and you did not come for me. You will never be able to make that untrue. Not with a name, not with a crown, not with all the letters in the world." And she walked out of the corridor and left the King of Valemore kneeling on the flagstones. Osric Thrale was waiting at the top of the private stair. Of course he was. He had a lamp and his old grey coat over his nightshirt, and he looked exactly like a man woken by noise who had come half-dressed to see about a girl he loved. Some cold professional part of her stood back and admired it, because it was beautifully done. "Sorrel," he came down 2 steps. "You are shaking. I am not. Child, what has happened?" And Sorrel looked into the face of the man who had made her, and something in her went very quiet and very cold and very useful. She let the tears come. They did not need any encouragement. "He was taking him," she said. "Osric?" He was carrying him out through the postern in the dark. "Oh, my girl," said Osric Thrale, and his face broke into grief. And he came down the rest of the stairs, and put his arms around her, and he held her while she wept on him. "I had prayed I was wrong," he said into her hair. "I have suspected it since the spring, and I could not prove it, and I could not bear to say it to you. He did away with the first one, Sorrel. There was a child in the marches, and it did not survive the spring. And he saw to that, and I laid the poor scrap in the crypt myself, and I have carried it alone rather than put it in your head." Sorrel wept into the warden's coat and thought, with absolute and crystalline calm, "That is not true. There was never a first one. There was only ever wick, and that thing on the bier was wax, and nobody died in the spring, and you made a coffin for a child who had not yet been born, which means you knew. You knew in the spring that there was a woman in the Ash March carrying the king's child, and I had told no living soul, and I had written to nobody, and I was 12 days from any road. You knew because you had already put men on it. You have been trying to kill my son since before he had a face. What do we do?" she sobbed. She felt him go still with satisfaction. She felt it come off him, warm and pleased, the way a stove gives out heat. "Listen to me," said Osric gently. "The Aldwych envoy is in this house, sitting at our table, sworn to an alliance with a man who murders his own infants in the dark." He held her at arm's length. "If it comes from me, they will say the warden is grasping. It must come from you, the mother, the one soul in Valemore with nothing to gain and everything to lose. They will not believe me. I am the mad marcher woman." "They will believe you," said Osric Thrale. Because I shall stand behind you and swear that every word of it is true." And he smiled at her kindly, the way he had smiled at a small girl who had got her letters right. "Come," he said, "and bring the boy. They will need to see him." The moon court at the 4th hour of the morning was all candles and half-dressed lords, and one very cold foreign delegation. Lord Crane of Aldwych stood at the foot of the dais with a face like a closed fist, and his daughter stood beside him. And Verity looked across that white floor at Sorrel and went absolutely rigid. They had brought Emeric up from the corridor. He stood alone in front of his own throne, with 2 of the warden's men on either side of him, and he had not been allowed to change his traveling cloak. And every soul in that room could see the postern key still in his hand. He looked at Sorrel coming through the doors with their son in her arms and the warden's hand on her shoulder. And she watched the last light in him go out. He thought she had come to bury him. She saw the exact moment he decided it, and she saw him accept it, and she saw him lift his chin and prepare to die well. And Sorrel Danvin nearly came apart on the floor of the moon court. "I am sorry," she told him, with no words at all. "I am so sorry. Hold on." "My lords," said Osric Thrail, "it grieves me beyond speech to bring this before you." He laid it out, and he was magnificent. A decent man wading through a filthy business because the realm required it, speaking of the child in the marches, and the crypt, and the boat, waiting in the reeds tonight. By the time he had finished, there was not a man in that hall who would not have hanged Emeric Voss with his own belt. "And this is the mother," said Osric, and his hand tightened on her shoulder as he moved her forward into the center of the floor. "Every one of you has called her a liar. Ask her what she saw tonight." Every face in the moon court turned to Sorrel. She stood on the stone where she had been broken open in front of the world, with her son in her arms, and found that she was not frightened at all. "I saw the king," she said. The hall leaned in. "I saw the king take my son out of his cradle and carry him toward the postern gate in the dark, and I put a knife on him, and I took my child back. And every word the warden has told you about tonight is true." "But the rest of it is a lie," said Sorrel, "and I would like this hall to be very still." The silence that fell in the moon court was the deepest she had ever heard. "My lord warden has told you that he rode into the ash marsh in the spring and laid a child of mine in this crypt with his own hands." She turned and looked at him. "So I shall ask him in front of the envoy of Aldwych, and I shall ask him to be careful. When Osric, say it again, and say it slowly." Osric Thrail's face did not move at all. "Grief has unsettled her," he said. "Answer her," said Lord Crane of Aldwych. "The child died in the 4th week of the thaw." "Then here is my difficulty," said Sorrel Danvin, and she turned to the hall. "I have lived in that valley since the day I was born. There is one road in and one ford across the water, and 9 families on it, and not one of them has anything to talk about between the thaw and the shearing. If the warden of the naming rolls had ridden into the ash marsh in the spring with a horse and a coffin and a burial party, I would have known before he crossed the ford, and so would every soul from the river to the high shieling." Her voice went up into the rafters. "Send and ask them. I will wait in a cell for the answer, and I will pay for the writer myself." Nobody moved. He was never there. There was no burial in the spring, because there was no child in the spring. There has only ever been this one, and he was born in the byre of my own croft, in the autumn, on my knees in the straw, with nobody in the world to hold on to. She lifted Wick against her shoulder. "So, open the coffin." The words went across that white floor, like a hawk going through a hedge. "It is lying on a bier in his own crypt, with a sprig of ash on it. Open it in front of Aldwych. If there is a child in that box, I will lie down on this stone and let you hang me for a liar, and I will not say one word in my own defense." Her chin came up. "And if there is a doll of wax and clay in it, packed all round with ash and lavender, because a wolf can smell a lie, Then I would like every man here to ask himself one question. Who orders a coffin in the spring for a boy who has not yet been born? The silence had a floor to it. Search the west stair, she said. There is a dead man in the tower who came up my wall with a knife, and I tracked him back across the yard. And I can walk any one of you over every step of it. And it ends at the warden's door. Open it, said Lord Crane. And Osric Thrale ran, not for the door. He was too old and far too clever for that. He ran 3 steps at Sorrel, with a knife out of his sleeve, and his whole weight behind it, straight at the child in her arms, because it had never once, in all of this, been about anything else. And Sorrel Danvin turned her hip and stepped inside the line of the blade and did what he had taught her to do in a wet lane in the Ash March when she was 12 years old. He went down onto the white floor of the Moon Court with his arm bent the wrong way and his own knife under his chin and Wick screaming, and Sorrel's knee in his spine. She put her mouth close to his ear. You taught me to watch the feet, she said. You should have remembered that I would be watching yours. Then they took the warden of the naming rolls out of the Moon Court on his face, and it was done. The hall was in uproar and Lord Crane was shouting for the crypt. And Emeric Voss crossed that floor to her like a man walking through fire. Sorrel, he said. His face was wide open. He was crying. He did not seem to have noticed. You came for me. I came for a traitor, said Sorrel Danvin. He stopped dead. I came because a man tried to murder my son, and because you were about to hang for it, and then my boy would have had no father and no name at all. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest thing in the room. Do not mistake it for anything else. There was not 1 second of forgiveness in it. Sorrel. He reached for her. The tether. You felt it. I know you did. Yes, she said. I did. And the hope came up in his face, like the sun coming over a hill. And it does not fix 1 single thing, said Sorrel. You thought our son was dead, and you did not come for me. That is not a lie you told. That is a thing. You are. Her chin came up, and the tears came down, and neither of them stopped. I am glad you are alive. You will be a good king. I think you always could have been. Please, he said. But I cannot trust you, said Sorrel Danvin, and I do not know that I ever will. And she carried their son out of the Moon Court, through 300 people, and not one of them said a word. The realm called it the Warden's Winter afterwards, and told it badly, the way realms do. They opened the coffin that same night. There was a doll of wax and clay inside it, dressed in the grey of the Moon Court, and packed all round with ash and lavender. And Lord Crane of Aldwych looked at it a long while, and then went and stood by a window on his own. They searched the west stair, and they found the ledgers. 30 years of them in a beautiful clerical hand, and a list of names at the back of the newest book that made even the hardest men in that room set it down and step away from the table. 6 of them were children. 1 was a woman of the Ash March, described only as the tracker, and beside her name somebody had written, with great neatness, and the whelp. Osric Thrale went into the old keep under lock, and in all the long months of it he never once asked to see her. That was the part she could not forgive, not the knife, the silence. And Valemore, which had watched a Marcher woman broken open on that white floor and had laughed at her, changed its mind the way a court does, all at once, and without a word of apology. Verity Crane broke the betrothal herself, in the politest and most devastating letter Sorrel had ever read, and then declined to go home. My father has 4 other daughters, she said, with her feet up on Sorrel's table, and I find I like it here. She was, it turned out, the closest thing to a friend Sorrel had ever had, and the boy still had no name. That was Sorrel's doing, and everybody knew it, and nobody dared say a word. The rolls were open. There was a new warden, an anxious little man from the treasury, who would have written anything the king told him to, and there was not 1 soul left in Valemore who would have raised a hand against the child, and the whole realm was waiting, and the king was waiting. And Sorrel Danvin said no, because the moment that name went into the book, her son belonged to the crown. He would be raised by tutors, and dressed in grey, and taught to smile at people he despised, and he would be Emeric's, in law, and in blood, and in every hall in the kingdom, and she would be a woman who had once carried him. And she did not trust Emmerich Voss. That was the whole of it. She had lain alone in her bed in the ash march that spring, and he had known, and he had not come. So she called her son Wick, which meant nothing, and she used it 100 times a day. He courted her for the best part of a year, and he did it honestly, which was much harder to bear. He wrote to her twice a week, 3 times, in his own hand, and he never once put an apology at the top of a letter where it could be used as a door. He wrote about the salt roads. He wrote about a pension dispute in the lower city, and asked her plainly what she would do, and when she sent back 4 furious lines, he went and did the thing she said. He wrote once, halfway down a page she had sworn she would burn, that he had taken the coffin out of the crypt and burned it in the yard, and that it had not helped in the least. He did not send flowers. He knew better. He sent, in the 4th month, a cradle. He had made it himself, and it was a disgrace. The legs did not match, and it went over sideways the first time she touched it, and Sorrel sat down on the nursery floor and laughed until she could not breathe, and then cried for an hour. She kept it, and she never told him. And once a month, quietly, in a doorway, with nobody else there, he asked the same thing. Sorrel, may I come and sit with you and the boy this evening? And every month, Sorrel Danvin said no. You are being a fool, said Verity Crane. In the 8th month, with great affection, I am being careful. You are being a coward, which is a different thing, and it does not suit you. You would rather sit up here strangling a bond, with your own 2 hands, than take one honest risk, and I have watched you do it for 8 months, and I am running out of patience and wine. Sorrel did not answer her, because the tether was still there. That was the thing nobody knew. She had shut it behind a door, in her chest, the way you shut a room, in a house you cannot afford to heat. And it did not wither, and it did not fade, and every night of that long year, she lay in the dark, and felt him on the other side of it, awake. In the 11th month a letter came that was different. It was very short. Sorrel, I have asked you every month for a year, and every month for a year you have said no, and I have finally understood that you were telling me the truth, and I was refusing to hear it, which is, I am told, a fault of mine. So I will stop. You do not owe me a hearing. You do not owe me a name in a book. You owe me nothing at all, and I am sorry it has taken me this long to say so. I will not trouble you again. She read it 4 times. She sat by the fire for a long while, with the letter in her hand, and the room was very warm, and she had everything she had ever asked for, and she had never been so cold in her life. He kept his word. No letters. In the corridors he inclined his head to her, master of the hounds, perfectly courteous, never cold, and never anything else. And she found that she would have given a finger for one bad joke. It lasted 9 days. On the 10th, Verity Crane came into her office, without knocking, with a face the color of paper. He is gone. Sorrel stood up so fast the chair went over John. Not in his rooms, not in the council. His grey is on the stand, and his ring is on the table, and his horse is in the stable eating. Verity swallowed. The gate says nobody rode out. The postern says nobody walked out. Sorrel, that man has 100 people watching him at all times. And he has simply, she did not finish it. Sorrel was already moving. She was master of the hounds, and she did it properly, because doing it properly was the only thing standing between her and screaming. No bells, no alarm. Trackers on the chambers and on every gate. She went over his rooms herself on her hands and knees, and she found the grey coat on its stand, and the ring on the table, and the traveling cloak gone from the press, and no boots, and no money, and no sword. And on the table a folded paper with her name on it. Sorrel, I said I would stop asking and I meant it. And I am not asking. I have gone back to the only place I was ever worth anything to you. If you never come, I shall understand it, and I will not blame you for 1 hour of it. And I hope you will be very happy, and I hope the boy grows up, nothing like me. Sorrel stood in the empty room of the King of Vale Moor and did the arithmetic. 12 days on foot to the Ash March for a fit man who knew the road. He was not a fit man, and he did not know the road, and it was the first week of the long frost. He will die, she said out loud. She was on the road inside the hour with 4 trackers and a string of horses and Verity Crane, who could not track anything, and got on a horse anyway, and dared anybody to comment. On the second night, camped in a snow hollow, with the wind coming off the high marches like a blade, Sorrel put her hand flat on her chest and opened the door she had held shut for a year. It hit her like a wall coming down. Cold. Bone deep, killing cold. Exhaustion. Pain in a leg. Fear. And under the fear, a terrible, patient, resigned peace. A man who has stopped expecting to be found and has decided to be all right about it. And underneath all of it, steady as a heartbeat, the same thing that had been on the other side of that door every single night for a year, her. Sorrel was on her horse before she had finished the thought. She found him at the end of the 4th day, and it was her own croft. Of course it was. The door was shut. There was no smoke. There was one set of tracks going in, dragging, and none coming out, and the snow had half filled them. And Sorrel came off that horse before it stopped and went through her own door with her heart in her mouth. The King of Valemore was on the floor of her croft, with his back against the cold hearth, and his cloak over his knees, and no fire. The wood was there, the kindling was there, the tinder was there. It was all laid out in front of him in a hopeless, meticulous heap, and it had plainly been there for hours. And Emmerich Voss looked up at her with a face gone gray and his lips gone blue and said, with enormous dignity, "I still cannot lay a fire." Sorrel Danvan made a sound that was not a laugh and was not a sob, and had a great deal of both in it. She had that fire going in 90 seconds. She had his boots off and his wet things off, and every blanket in the Ash March on him before he could argue. And he kept trying to talk, and she kept telling him to be quiet, and her hands shook so badly that she burned herself twice. "You walked," she said. "In the frost you did," he said. 300 miles, with a baby." He was slurring. "I should like it on the record that you are considerably better at this than I am. You could have died. But I could not think of another way to say it, that you would believe." She stopped. She was kneeling on the floor of her mother's croft with her hands full of his freezing hands, and the fire going up behind her, and Emmerich Voss looked at her with his whole life in his face. "I did not come for you in the spring," he said. "So I came. In the winter. It is a year late, and it is the best I have." And Sorrel Danvan put her forehead against his and wept. "Marry me," he said, into her hair. His voice had gone to nothing. "Sorrel, I have no crown here, and no court, and no clever answer, and I am so cold I cannot feel my own hands. Marry me. You are half dead. I am aware. You are not in your right mind." "I have not been in my right mind," said the King of Valemore, "since a woman pulled me out of a snowdrift and asked me if I could skin a hare. She was laughing and crying and did not know which, and did not care. 'Ask me again,' she said, 'when you can stand up.'" His eyes were closing. "And you will say yes," he mumbled, with total confidence, entirely asleep. Sorrel sat back on her heels in the firelight and looked at the man on her floor. "Ask me," she said, "and find out." It took him 5 months. He asked her every day of them, which was, Verity observed, the most work anybody had ever seen an Alpha King do. He asked her over the salt ledgers until the treasury threatened to resign. He asked her on the North Road with the rain coming sideways. He asked her badly and beautifully, and once, appallingly, in front of 40 Aldwych merchants. And every day she said, "Ask me tomorrow." Until one entirely ordinary morning in the spring, When the man was sitting on the floor of the nursery, with his son standing on his knees, and both hands full of the king's hair, and he looked up at her with his ridiculous, hopeful face. And Sorrel Danvin said yes. They did it in the moon court because she insisted. The same white floor, the same 300 people, the same herald who was extremely careful this time, having been spoken to at some length, and before the vows. Before anything, the Alpha King of Valemore walked the length of that hall with his son in his arms and stopped in front of the open rolls and put his hand on the page. "I name this boy," he said, and his voice went up into the rafters, and every soul in that room heard it. "He is my firstborn and my heir, and he was got in a croft in the Ashmarch in the long frost, by a woman who owed me nothing and saved my life anyway." He looked at Sorrel. "His mother calls him Wick," said Emmerich Voss. "It is a hearth name. It has no weight, and it cannot be written, and it will not stand up in any court in this realm." He turned to the new warden. "Write it." "Wick Danven Voss," said the king, and the pen went across the page, and 300 of the greatest wolves in Valemore watched a Marcher hearth name go into the naming rolls of the realm for the first time in 300 years. Then he handed the boy to Verity Crane, and he came back down that white floor to the woman standing in the middle of it. "You walked in here 18 months ago," he said, "and I did not come and get you." "No," said Sorrel, "you did not. I am aware that I cannot take that back." "You cannot, good," said Emmerich Voss, and he took both her hands. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life failing to." She was smiling. She could feel it going all the way up into her eyes, and she did not stop it. "No, taking it back," she said. "Not one word of it," said the king.